Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the man who preserved the Union, ended slavery, and changed the course of American history. Nearly every schoolchild learns the same basic story. He was born in a humble log cabin in Kentucky, rose from poverty through determination, and became one of America's greatest presidents. But beneath that familiar story lies a family mystery that historians argued over for more than 150 years. It wasn't about politics or war. It was about Lincoln's own mother, a secret so sensitive that Lincoln reportedly asked his closest friend never to reveal it while he was alive. For generations, that secret remained buried beneath fading court records, family rumors, and bitter academic debates. Then, more than a century after Lincoln's death, modern DNA technology finally entered the picture. Scientists expected to settle one long-running historical argument. Instead, they uncovered evidence that confirmed one of Lincoln's most private beliefs while opening the door to an even older story stretching back thousands of years. To understand why this mattered so much, you first have to understand the world Lincoln's mother was born into. Life on the American frontier in the late 18th century was harsh enough without carrying a social stain that could follow someone forever. Society judged people by family reputation as much as personal character, and children born outside marriage often paid the highest price. Under English common law, such children had almost no legal standing. They generally could not inherit from their fathers, had limited legal rights, and frequently carried their mother's surname instead. The circumstances of their birth could become a lifelong burden. For unmarried women, the consequences could be equally severe. Local courts sometimes prosecuted cases involving pregnancies outside marriage, particularly in frontier communities where moral laws were enforced aggressively. Public embarrassment, fines, and lasting damage to a family's reputation were common. In many places, the shame outlived the legal punishment by decades. Families often responded the only way they believed they could. Secrets were protected at all costs. Children were sometimes raised by grandparents, aunts, or uncles. Family histories were rewritten, uncomfortable truths quietly forgotten, and generations grew up without knowing the complete story of their own ancestry. Abraham Lincoln understood exactly how damaging such a secret could be. According to his longtime law partner and close friend, William Herndon, Lincoln confided something deeply personal during one of their many trips across Illinois. While traveling together, Lincoln allegedly admitted that his mother had been born outside of marriage and asked Herndon to keep that information private for as long as he lived. Herndon later recalled Lincoln saying that he believed his mother's father had been an educated Virginia gentleman whose identity was never publicly known. Whether Lincoln knew this as established fact or as family tradition remains uncertain, but one part of the conversation has echoed through history. Lincoln reportedly said, "All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." Those words became famous after Lincoln's death, but few people realized they carried an even deeper meaning if Herndon's account was accurate. Herndon honored Lincoln's request while his friend was alive. Everything changed after the assassination. Lincoln's death in 1865 transformed him from president into national legend. Americans wanted a heroic figure whose life seemed almost flawless. Anything that complicated that image became controversial. 24 years later, Herndon published an extensive biography based on decades of interviews, letters, and personal memories. Unlike many writers of his era, he refused to polish Lincoln into a perfect historical figure. He included the family secret Lincoln had entrusted to him, believing historical truth mattered more than public comfort. The reaction was explosive. Many readers accused Herndon of inventing stories simply to attract attention. Others believed he had misunderstood Lincoln's remarks or exaggerated private conversations. Lincoln's surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, strongly disliked Herndon's portrayal and spent years defending his father's reputation from what he viewed as unnecessary controversy. For decades, historians split into opposing camps. One group argued that Herndon had faithfully recorded what Lincoln told him. The other insisted the story rested on rumor rather than evidence. The problem was simple. Frontier records from the late 1700s were incomplete, inconsistent, and often contradictory. Birth certificates were rare, church records were missing, and official documents frequently disappeared over time. Then researchers discovered something far more concrete. Deep inside Kentucky court archives rested an old legal record dating to November 1789. It documented that a woman named Lucy Hanks had been indicted on a charge related to giving birth outside marriage. Today, such a document may seem surprising, but in the 18th century it reflected how seriously communities enforced moral laws. Court records like these have survived in several early American colonies, offering modern historians rare glimpses into everyday life on the frontier. The timing immediately caught researchers' attention. Nancy Hanks, Abraham Lincoln's mother, is believed to have been born several years before Lucy Hanks eventually married Henry Sparrow in 1790. That chronology appeared to support the possibility that Nancy had indeed been born before her mother's marriage. Even more intriguing was another surviving document. Lucy Hanks personally signed a written statement giving her consent to marry Henry Sparrow. Shortly afterward, the legal proceedings against her disappeared from court records. To some historians, the sequence fit together naturally. Lucy faced legal trouble, later married, and moved forward with her life. Nancy, however, continued using the Hanks surname rather than Sparrow, something many researchers considered significant because children born outside marriage commonly retained their mother's family name. Still, documents alone could not answer every question. Historical records from frontier America are notoriously incomplete. Different families sometimes shared identical names, handwritten documents could be misread, and oral traditions changed as stories passed from one generation to another. Throughout the 20th century, historians continued arguing over the evidence. Some researchers proposed an entirely different explanation. They suggested Lucy Hanks may actually have been connected to another family and that Nancy had been born within a legitimate marriage after all. According to this theory, later generations had simply confused several women with similar names. Books were published defending both sides. Researchers spent decades examining wills, land transfers, marriage records, tax rolls, census reports, and family Bibles. Every new discovery seemed to answer one question while raising two more. By the early 21st century, the debate had lasted well over 100 years. Traditional genealogy had reached its limits. Then science offered historians a completely different kind of evidence. Instead of relying solely on faded ink and handwritten records, researchers realized they could examine something passed down through every generation unchanged for thousands of years. DNA. Abraham Lincoln himself left no direct descendants alive today. His family line eventually ended, making it impossible to test Lincoln's own children or grandchildren. But scientists didn't actually need them. What they needed was a continuous maternal line. Unlike most DNA, mitochondrial DNA passes almost exclusively from mother to child. Mothers pass it to both sons and daughters, but only daughters continue passing it to future generations. That means living descendants connected through an unbroken line of mothers can still carry essentially the same mitochondrial DNA as women who lived centuries ago. If researchers could locate descendants of Lucy Hanks' daughters through uninterrupted female lines, they could compare their genetic signatures with descendants connected to competing family theories. It would be one of the most unusual collaborations between genealogy and modern genetics. Finding the right participants was anything but easy. Researchers spent years tracing complicated family trees stretching back to the 18th century. Every branch had to be carefully documented because a single mistaken connection could invalidate the results. Eventually, enough qualified descendants agreed to participate. Samples were collected and sent for laboratory analysis. For the first time, a historical debate that had divided scholars for generations would be tested not by opinion, but by biology. No one involved expected what the results would ultimately reveal. The researchers knew the DNA results had the potential to settle one of American history's longest-running family controversies. Still, even they were surprised by how clear the evidence turned out to be. After years of tracing family lines, collecting samples, and verifying genealogical records, the mitochondrial DNA tests were completed. The analysis focused on descendants connected through uninterrupted maternal lines, allowing scientists to compare genetic signatures inherited from the same female ancestors. When the results arrived, one pattern stood out immediately. Every verified descendant traced through Hanks, Lucy Hanks' mother, shared the same mitochondrial DNA profile. The matches were consistent across multiple family branches, strongly indicating that the women all descended from the same maternal ancestor. Meanwhile, descendants connected to the competing Shipley theory carried an entirely different mitochondrial DNA signature. Their results simply didn't match the Hanks descendants. For many genealogists, that was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Although DNA cannot identify the unknown biological father of Nancy Hanks, it can confirm whether different maternal lines are related. In this case, the evidence overwhelmingly supported the traditional Hanks maternal line while offering no support for the alternate Shipley hypothesis. After more than 150 years of disagreement, one of the biggest questions surrounding Lincoln's maternal ancestry finally had a scientific answer. But the testing revealed something else that few researchers had expected. The mitochondrial DNA belonged to a remarkably uncommon maternal lineage known as haplogroup X1c. To most people, that name means very little. To genetic genealogists, however, it immediately stood out. Most Americans whose families trace back to colonial Britain, Ireland, or Germany belong to several very common European mitochondrial haplogroups. These lineages appear in millions of people today and are exactly what researchers usually expect to find in families that arrived during America's colonial period. Haplogroup X1c is different. It is extremely rare. Its ancient roots point toward populations associated with North Africa and parts of the Near East thousands of years ago, long before modern nations or surnames even existed. That discovery surprised many observers, but it's important to understand what it actually means. The DNA did not suggest that Lincoln's mother or grandmother recently came from North Africa or the Middle East. It did not reveal a hidden 19th-century family secret. Instead, it highlighted something scientists have understood for years. Human ancestry is far more interconnected than many people assume. Every population has experienced migrations, intermarriages, and movements over countless generations. Ancient maternal lineages often survive in places far removed from where they first originated. In other words, Lincoln's maternal DNA wasn't rewriting American history so much as reminding us that the history of humanity has never been as simple as neat family trees suggest. Ironically, while some people spent generations trying to prove the purity of colonial bloodlines, genetics continued demonstrating that nearly everyone's ancestry is far more complex than family legends admit. Yet beyond the science lies an even more compelling human story. Who was Nancy Hanks herself? She often appears in history books only as Abraham Lincoln's mother, but her own life was filled with hardship long before her son entered the world. Born around 1784 on the American frontier, Nancy grew up during a period when survival itself demanded constant resilience. Records from the era are sparse, making it difficult to reconstruct every detail of her childhood, but historians generally agree that she spent much of her youth being raised by relatives rather than by her mother. After the death of her grandfather, Joseph Hanks, she went to live with her Aunt Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow and Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Sparrow. There she learned practical frontier skills that every family depended upon. She became known for sewing, weaving, reading scripture, and managing the countless responsibilities required to keep a frontier household functioning. Neighbors later described her as thoughtful, hard-working, deeply religious, and unusually intelligent. Those qualities would leave a lasting impression on her young son. In 1806, Nancy married Thomas Lincoln. Neither of them lived lives of comfort. Their family struggled financially, moving from Kentucky to Indiana in search of better opportunities. Like countless frontier families, they built cabins by hand, cleared forests, planted crops, and faced constant uncertainty. 3 children were born to the couple. Their daughter Sarah survived into adulthood. A second son died in infancy. Their middle child was Abraham Lincoln. Then tragedy struck. In 1818, a mysterious illness swept through parts of southern Indiana. Known today as milk sickness, the disease resulted from cows eating poisonous white snakeroot plants. At the time, no one understood its cause. Entire families became sick. Neighbors died within days. Nancy herself fell ill after caring for others in the community. She died at only 34 years old. Abraham was just 9 years old. The loss stayed with him forever. Because there were no professional coffin makers nearby, Lincoln and his father reportedly helped construct her simple wooden coffin before she was buried near the family cabin. Years later, Lincoln would repeatedly speak of his mother's influence on his character and education. Whether discussing her kindness, intelligence, or moral guidance, he credited her with shaping the person he became. That famous statement, "All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my angel mother," was not simply sentimental. It reflected genuine admiration for a woman whose own life had been marked by hardship from the very beginning. Looking back, the true significance of this story isn't really about DNA. Nor is it about exposing some hidden scandal. Instead, it shines a light on the social realities of early America. A woman could face legal punishment because she became pregnant outside marriage. A child could inherit lifelong prejudice over circumstances completely beyond their control. Entire families sometimes buried uncomfortable truths simply to survive within their communities. Those attitudes shaped countless lives, not just the Lincoln family. If Lincoln truly believed his mother had been born outside marriage, it's easy to understand why he asked Herndon to remain silent. Politics during the 19th century could be vicious. Opponents searched relentlessly for anything that might damage a rival's reputation. Family background, financial troubles, rumors, and personal history were all considered fair game. Whether such an accusation would actually have harmed Lincoln politically is impossible to know. But Lincoln clearly believed it had the potential to become a weapon. So he kept the matter private. More than a century later, science finally examined the evidence without political agendas or family rivalries. The DNA did not identify Nancy Hanks' biological father. That mystery remains unsolved and may never be answered. No confirmed document names him. No verified genetic evidence points to a specific individual. Some family traditions spoke of a prosperous Virginia landowner. Others suggested different possibilities. None have ever been conclusively proven. Sometimes history simply leaves questions unanswered. Even so, the broader picture has become much clearer. Modern genetic research strongly supports that Nancy Hanks belonged to the Hanks maternal line rather than the alternate Shipley theory. It confirms that one of the most persistent debates surrounding Lincoln's ancestry rested on a genuine historical foundation rather than simple rumor. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that greatness is never determined by ancestry. Abraham Lincoln's achievements were not the product of noble birth, inherited privilege, or prestigious family connections. He grew up with little formal education. He spent years doing manual labor. He borrowed books because his family could not afford them. He taught himself law. He rose through determination, discipline, and remarkable intelligence. When the United States faced its greatest constitutional crisis, he carried the nation through civil war and helped bring slavery to an end. None of those accomplishments depended on whether his mother had been born inside or outside marriage. If anything, the story makes his rise even more remarkable. It shows that extraordinary people can emerge from the most ordinary, and sometimes the most difficult circumstances. The DNA evidence did not diminish Abraham Lincoln's legacy. It reinforced it. It confirmed that behind one of America's greatest presidents stood a mother who overcame enormous social obstacles, a family that lived through poverty and uncertainty, and generations whose stories had nearly been lost to history. In the end, perhaps Lincoln himself understood the lesson better than anyone else. He never defined his mother by the circumstances of her birth. He defined her by her character. History has ultimately done the same. And maybe that's the greatest discovery of all, not hidden in old court records or modern laboratories, but in the realization that courage, integrity, and greatness are measured by what people become, not by the circumstances into which they are born.